Welcome to the deep dive. Now, if you're looking at the Russia-Ukraine conflict and thinking it's, primarily a tragic regional event, well, our sources for this deep dive suggest there's a much bigger picture.
Yeah, that's right.
We've got analysts here arguing this conflict wasn't necessarily the start of global change, but maybe the key catalyst, the thing that made these deep structural shifts really irreversible.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And our job today, really, is to unpack those arguments. We're going beyond the immediate headlines to look at how this conflict is, according to these sources, actually dismantling the U.S.-led unipolar system.
And challenging how we even measure power, right,
Right.
with things like GDP.
Exactly. Challenging Western economic metrics and really accelerating what some are calling the post-American era. We're focusing squarely on the geopolitical and the economic countershocks here.
Okay, so here's the plan for you, our listener. We're basically tracking three massive structural consequences that emerge from this material. First up, the rapid geopolitical alignment, the non-Western world coming together as more of a bloc. Second, the breakdown or maybe even collapse of that old post-war center-periphery economic system.
A really fundamental shift there.
And third, the rise of Eurasia, the idea that the Eurasian landmass is becoming dominant, which is a huge challenge to, 500 years of sea power being the main thing?
Pretty much, yeah. A massive historical pivot.
Okay.
So let's dive in.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first, maybe most obvious piece of evidence for this shift is how countries reacted to the sanctions on Russia.
Right. That was immediate.
Immediately after the conflict began, you saw non-Western major powers basically refusing to follow the U.S. lead. And this, the argument goes, accelerated their collective rise.
The sources lay this out really clearly. You look at who did follow the sanctions. It's mostly North America, Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, kind of the traditional Western-aligned group.
Usual suspects, you might say.
Yeah, but then you look at the non-Western powers, and it's a long list. China, India, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, Pakistan, Mexico, Egypt, Nigeria, the Islamic world. Basically, they either said no to the sanctions or just didn't enforce them.
It's a huge chunk of the global population and economy right there.
It really is.
And this connects to a pretty powerful quote cited in the analysis. It's attributed to Massimo D'Alema, the former Italian PM.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
He said something like, Russia is isolated by the West, but the West finds itself increasingly isolated by the rest of the world.
Wow. That really flips the narrative, doesn't it?
It does, and the sources argue this reflects a deeper feeling in the non-Western world. While the invasion itself is obviously controversial, the perceived objective behind it.
Which is what, exactly? Overturning the unipolar system.
Right. To challenge that U.S.-led order and push for something more equal, more multipolar, that objective, the sources say, is widely supported, or at least understood by many non-Western nations, that there's this undercurrent of the world has suffered under U.S. hegemony for too long.
So it's less about approving the specific actions and more about agreeing with the perceived goal of shaking up the status quo.
That seems to be the core argument presented here. And it's not just talk. We see concrete actions cited as examples.
Like what?
Well, think about China and Russia conducting joint bomber patrols over the Sea of Japan and the East China Sea. And they did this during the Quad Summit in Tokyo.
Okay, that's a very deliberate signal.
A very public statement of alignment, yes. And it's not just Asia. The sources also point to Latin America.
Summit of the Americas.
Exactly. Over 20 countries, including Mexico, either boycotted or protested because the U.S. excluded places like Cuba.
So countries are increasingly willing to just say no to Washington.
It suggests a growing confidence, a willingness to actively push back, and that's seen as a key indicator of this bigger structural shift happening.
Okay, so this geopolitical split seems to be feeding directly into a breakdown of the global economic structure, specifically this center-periphery system you mentioned earlier.
That's the argument. They're deeply linked.
Before we get into the breakdown, maybe just quickly define that center-periphery idea again for our listeners. What was that old system like?
Sure. So think of it as a kind of fixed global economic club set up after World War II. The Western nations were the center.
Right.
They controlled the main currency, the dollar, most advanced technology, the financial rules through institutions like the IMF and World Bank. And this setup allowed the center to, well, the source material uses the term super exploit the periphery.
The periphery being the non-Western states.
Exactly. The system tended to keep the periphery nations economically dependent, often poorer, while the center maintained its dominance and extracted wealth.
Okay. And China was kind of the first major crack in that system.
A massive crack, yes. Through its incredible industrial and technological development over decades, China managed to become the biggest trade partner, capital source, tech partner for both the old center countries and the periphery.
That's a unique position.
Absolutely unique. And the sources argue that's why predictions were made back in 2018 that the U.S. would ultimately, not win the trade war it started. China was just too integrated everywhere.
Okay, so China disrupted it first. Now, how does Russia fit into this picture post-conflict?
Well, the conflict, according to this analysis, really elevated Russia. It became a sort of second independent pole operating outside that old center-periphery dynamic,
How so?
mainly through its successful financial countermoves against the sanctions. The big one was the ruble settlement order for energy.
Where they demanded payment in rubles for gas.
Right. Which effectively flipped the script. The West tried to wage a currency war, isolate the ruble, but Russia turned it into a resource war about energy, about food, things the world absolutely needs.
And this ties into the whole de-dollarization thing.
Massively. When the West froze Russia's central bank assets, hundreds of billions of dollars,
Yeah, that was unprecedented.
it sent a huge signal. Every country holding large dollar reserves suddenly thought, wait, can my assets be seized if I fall out of favor with the U.S.?
So it wasn't just about Russia anymore.
Not at all. It damaged trust in the dollar system itself. And this, combined with kicking Russia out of SWIFT.
SWIFT being the main international bank messaging system.
Correct. It just poured fuel on the fire for countries to accelerate building their own cross-border payment systems, their own digital currencies, ways to trade that bypass the dollar and SWIFT completely.
So Russia's defiance, coupled with the West's reaction, actually solidified Russia's position outside the old system and sped up the move away from dollar dependence globally.
That's precisely the argument. You now have these two major poles emerging outside the old structure. China offering, products, capital, trade, technology. Russia offering essential resources, energy, food, and demonstrating military power willing to challenge the unipolar order.
Put them together, the China-Russia pole.
And the synergy, the sources argue, is more powerful than just adding them up separately. It's like a 1 + 1 = 3 effect, creating a real alternative center of gravity.
Okay, this economic shift raises a really fundamental question, doesn't it? How do we actually measure who's powerful in this changing world? Because the sources we're looking at argue the traditional Western ways are, well, broken.
Yeah, they make a strong case that relying on indicators like nominal GDP, especially calculated in U.S. dollars, gives a really misleading picture. It seriously underestimates the comprehensive national power of countries like Russia and China.
Why is nominal GDP so flawed, according to them?
Well, a big reason is it heavily weights the service sector, things like finance, consulting, real estate. These sectors can inflate the GDP numbers of Western economies quite a bit.
Okay.
But they don't necessarily reflect the country's ability to actually produce tangible things, physical goods, energy, resources. And in times of conflict or major geopolitical stress, it's that tangible production that really matters, not just financial services.
So you use a pretty striking example with Russia's economy, right? The ruble volatility.
Oh, yeah, it's most absurd when you look at it through the nominal GDP lens. The ruble crashes, 85% initially after the sanctions, then it surges back up 25%.
Right.
If you calculate Russia's nominal GDP in dollars during that fluctuation, it implies Russia's entire economy suddenly shrank to be smaller than one province in China, Anhui province, the example given. And then a month later, it magically grew 25% larger overnight.
Which is obviously ridiculous. An economy doesn't just disappear and reappear like that based on currency swings.
Exactly. That's the absurdity they point to. Nominal GDP is just too vulnerable to exchange rate fluctuations and financial market sentiment. It doesn't reflect the underlying real economy or its productive capacity.
So the whole idea that a huge country with vast resources and industry could, on paper, shrink below a single province just because of currency markets, that's the core flaw they're highlighting.
That's the essence of it, yeah. The metric is measuring the currency's value against the dollar, not the actual economic output, and importantly, the cost of living within Russia.
So what's the alternative measure they prefer?
The main one they champion is purchase power parity, or PPP.
Okay, PPP. How does that work, basically?
Yeah, basically, PPP tries to compare economies based on what a certain amount of money can actually buy in each country. It accounts for differences in the cost of living and non-tradable services. So it gives you a better sense of the real size and standard of living.
And when you apply PPP, the picture changes quite a bit.
Dramatically.
Yeah.
The sources cite a French economist's recalculation using PPP. It puts Russia's economy around $4.4 trillion.
Which is much higher than its usual nominal ranking, closer to Germany, right?
Exactly. Very close to Germany's PPP estimate of $4.6 trillion. Far, far higher than where nominal GDP places it.
And what about China using PPP?
The same economist estimates China's PPP economy at a huge $27 trillion. That's actually 20% larger than the U.S. estimate using the same method. It puts China at nearly 30% of the entire world economy on a PPP basis.
Wow. So the takeaway is that real power in this new era, it's about more than just dollar-denominated GDP.
Definitely. The argument is that future great power competition hinges on comprehensive strength. Things like leadership, institutional stability, social cohesion, and crucially, the tangible ability to produce essential resources, energy, and manufactured goods. Not just high numbers in service sectors that might not be sustainable or relevant in a crisis.
Okay, that makes sense. If power is increasingly about tangible resources and industrial output, not just financial numbers, then geography becomes really important again.
Absolutely.
And this leads into the next major theme. The idea that this conflict is accelerating a massive historical shift away from sea power towards land power centered on the Eurasian continent.
Precisely. We're talking about challenging a 500-year pattern where Western nations, primarily maritime powers, dominated by controlling sea lanes and coastal regions. Now the focus is shifting inland to the vast Eurasian landmass.
What's driving that shift conceptually?
Well, on the land power side, you have major initiatives. China's Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, is key.
That's their huge global infrastructure plan.
Right. And its stated philosophy, according to the sources, is about replacing geo-competition with geo-cooperation. They use the phrase consultation, joint contribution, shared benefits. It's about connecting Eurasia through infrastructure.
And China's geography helps here, doesn't it? They have both the huge land border and the long coastline.
That's a crucial point highlighted in the analysis. China has this unique ability to pursue what they call a sea-land balance. They aren't forced to choose between maritime trade and continental links. They can do both, thanks to having a massive interior and 18,000 kilometers of coast.
Okay, so that's China's approach. What about Russia?
Russia's pushing its own concept, the Greater Eurasia Partnership. This is guided by an ideology often called Eurasianism.
Eurasianism. What's the core idea there?
At its heart, it's about Russia making a decisive return to the East, a pivot towards Asia. There's a belief that Asia, not the West, holds the future dynamism of the world economically, politically.
And you mentioned something interesting earlier. These Eurasian powers increasingly see themselves as civilization states?
Yes, that's a really interesting concept emerging from the source material. Powers like China, Russia, Iran, Turkey, India. They're defining themselves not just as modern nation-states in the Western mold, but as distinct civilization states.
What does that mean practically?
It means they root their identity and legitimacy in their own deep historical, cultural, and civilizational traditions, rather than adopting wholesale Western liberal democratic models. It's presented as a kind of identity-based resistance to what they perceive as Western unipolar arrogance or pressure to conform, a claim to civilizational equality, if you will.
The sheer scale of Eurasia is pretty mind-blowing when you look at the numbers.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The stats cited are stark. Eurasia holds roughly 75% of the world's population, accounts for about 60% of global GDP, and controls something like 75% of the world's energy resources.
That's an enormous concentration of people, economy, and energy.
It is, and you're seeing the physical connections accelerate. Sino-Russian trade, for example, jumped almost 30% according to these figures. Use of the Chinese RMB in Russia has apparently grown 13-fold. And crucial land corridors, railways like the China-Mongolia-Russia line and the China-Kyrgyzstan-Uzbekistan CKU railway are getting fast-tracked. It's about building the physical arteries for this Eurasian integration.
Okay, so Eurasia is rising, the non-West is aligning, the economic metrics are being questioned. How is the U.S., the established power, reacting to all this?
Well, the sources outline a clear U.S. counter-strategy, trying to build a new kind of containment structure.
How?
Two main ways. First, expanding NATO's focus beyond Europe into the Indo-Pacific. Inviting countries like South Korea, Japan, Australia to NATO summits is seen as part of this.
Trying to create a more global anti-Russia, anti-China front?
Essentially, yes. And second, forming exclusive economic clubs, things like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, or the G7's Build Back Better World, now Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment.
And the goal of those is pretty explicit, right? To offer an alternative to China's BRI and counter that China-Russia bloc.
Exactly. They're presented as alternatives, although the sources are quite critical, suggesting they often lack the same scale of funding or concrete infrastructure commitments as BRI.
But has this counter-strategy worked? Or has there been blowback?
The sources argue strongly that it hasn't worked as intended and has actually generated significant anti-blowback, unintended negative consequences for the West itself. They detail three main forms.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is described as a structural economic collapse, particularly in Europe. The sanctions, especially on Russian energy, basically ruptured the energy supply chain.
Which then hit industry hard.
Very hard. This had knock-on effects, causing severe disruptions in industrial supply chains. The prime example always cited is the German chemical industry, which was heavily reliant on cheap, reliable Russian gas and oil. Cutting that off caused structural damage, not just a temporary blip.
Okay, that's Europe's economy. What's the second form of blowback?
The global food crisis. The conflict significantly disrupted wheat and fertilizer exports from both Russia and Ukraine, which are major global suppliers. This poses a direct survival threat, especially to poorer nations, and the sources warned this crisis could be even longer-lasting and more destabilizing than the energy crisis.
Now, a food crisis on top of an energy crisis. That's a grim picture. What's the third blowback?
This one hits the financial system. The decision to seize Russia's foreign reserves and block major Russian banks from SWIFT.
We talked about this earlier, the trust issue.
Precisely. The sources argue this fundamentally damaged the perceived reliability and neutrality of the U.S. dollar-based financial system. It directly accelerated the trend of central banks around the world reducing their holdings of U.S. dollars and looking for alternatives. It weakened the very system the U.S. leads.
So the core strategy of isolating Russia economically is actually failing.
It's failing, the analysis concludes, largely because the developing world, which now accounts for more than half the global economy on a PPP basis, is simply refusing to participate in the sanctions. They're choosing national interest, access to resources, or perhaps alignment with this emerging multipolar idea.
Okay, if isolation isn't working, what do the sources warn might be the next U.S. strategic move?
There's a warning here about the U.S. potentially seeking to manufacture new enemies or escalate tensions elsewhere. The term used is archfire, basically, stoking conflicts in other regions.
Where specifically?
Areas like the Taiwan Strait, the Korean Peninsula, potentially others.
And why would they do that, according to this view?
The analysis suggests a couple of reasons. First, possibly as a distraction from domestic problems, economic woes, political division. Second, to utilize a new model of proxy war.
Like Ukraine.
Similar, but maybe more focused on providing high-tech assistance, intelligence, funding, rather than just weapons. The consensus in these sources seems to be that the U.S. wants to avoid direct major power conflict itself, preferring to manage tensions and project power through regional proxies and crises.
Let's circle back to China amidst all this. How resilient is its currency, the RMB, in the face of potential U.S. financial pressure, like sanctions?
The assessment is extremely resilient.
Why so resilient?
Several factors. China is the world's largest manufacturer by a huge margin, the largest trading nation overall, and it holds massive foreign exchange reserves over $3 trillion. This gives its economy enormous capacity to absorb shocks.
So sanctions like those used against Russia wouldn't work the same way against China.
The conclusion presented is pretty stark. Any attempt at full-scale U.S. financial sanctions against China would effectively mean cutting off the global market from its primary supplier of goods. This would likely trigger a global economic collapse and, ironically, accelerate the final breakdown of the U.S. dollar system itself. The interdependence is just too deep.
Okay, but the conflict has had some negative impacts on China's plans, right? Particularly the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yes, absolutely. The sources acknowledge that the northern route of the BRI, which goes through Russia, has obviously been disrupted. And investments in Eastern Europe, particularly Ukraine, have been negatively affected or halted.
So how is China adapting? Have they changed the BRI strategy?
It seems so. The response described is one of rapid adaptation and shifting focus. There's now much more emphasis and investment going into the central and southern BR routes.
Which to where?
Through Central Asia, countries like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and then potentially via Iran and Turkey towards Europe. And also, crucially, deepening connectivity within the ASEAN bloc in Southeast Asia.
Ah, ASEAN. How is their relationship with China holding up amidst this U.S.-China competition?
It appears very solid, according to the data cited. Annual trade between China and the 10 ASEAN nations is around $800 billion. Chinese investment in the region is over $30 billion annually.
That's substantial. How does U.S. engagement compare?
Well, the sources point to U.S. attempts to woo ASEAN, like pledging $150 million in new commitments at a recent summit, as being, well, insufficient to really shift ASEAN's calculus.
So ASEAN isn't picking sides.
Pretty much. Their stance is generally described as pragmatic non-alignment. They benefit hugely from ties with China, and while they maintain relations with the U.S., they seem unwilling to decouple or choose one over the other. They're sticking to their own interests. Hashtag tag tag outro.
Okay, so let's try to pull this all together. We've covered the geopolitical splits, the breakdown of the old economic order, the challenge to Western metrics, the rise of Eurasia. What's the big takeaway from all this analysis?
I think the core message weeding through all these sources is that we are definitively in that great change unseen in a century that leaders have talked about. The move into what's being called the post-American era isn't just speculation anymore, it's structurally underway.
And the conflict acted as an accelerator.
A powerful accelerator, yes, making the speed of this multipolar development basically irreversible, according to these viewpoints.
And at the heart of it seems to be this fundamental clash of ideas or maybe visions for the world order.
That comes through very strongly. On one side, you have the U.S. approach, often characterized here as America first, or maintaining unipolar dominance, which the sources argue is increasingly losing the support or hearts of nations globally.
And the alternative vision.
On the other side, you have concepts like China's community of shared future for mankind, which, whether genuine or strategic, is presented as resonating more with the non-Western world's desire for multipolarity and development partnership, gaining hearts and minds, so to speak.
It really sets up a final question then, doesn't it?
I think it does.
If the conflict, despite the West's efforts, failed to financially cripple Russia and instead seems to have sped up this global pivot towards Eurasia and away from traditional Western financial dominance, then what metrics should we even use going forward?
Right. If sanctions prove less effective, if dollar-based GDP is misleading, how do future historians objectively measure who actually won or lost this contest? Not just the war itself, but this larger struggle over the shape of the global order. What will be the meaningful indicators of power and influence in this emerging era?
Something for all of us to think about as we watch these huge structural changes continue to unfold. That's all the time we have for this deep dive.